Hi, Misha here, and this is part 2 in a video looking at Soviet-Russian fighters from the Great Patriotic War in 1/72 scale diecast. And in the first video we looked at the I-16 and the MiG-1 and MiG-3 for what it's worth. Now we're going to move to maybe a somewhat kind of overlooked aircraft series, but one that was just as influential early in the war especially, but even afterwards. The Lavochkin La-5 maybe, and La-7. Of course, we'll also talk about the LaGG-1 and LaGG-3 because they're all kind of related. So with that, let's go back to the dawn of the Second World War in Stalin's Russia. The Lavochkin La-5, and this is the FN variant, so later production. But we really have to go back to the original Lavochkin, Grobinov, and Gudkov, which was the LaGG-1. Work began on this fighter all the way back in 1938, but it was part of that push beginning in 1939, and the first prototype was known as the LaGG-1, which flew in 1940. And this was essentially an all-wood aircraft with an inline engine. And yeah, it was economical. Russia had a lot of wood. It was durable, believe it or not, but it was far from perfect. So they made quite a few changes, and the LaGG-1 was only a prototype. The LaGG-3 was put into production after state testing, and in 1941 was one of the most advanced aircraft in production in the Soviet Union, although that's not really saying a lot. The LaGG-3 had kind of a wooden structure made of compressed wood that was actually pretty fire resistant and was a better performer at low altitude compared to the MiG-3. But the truth is, it didn't have a lot going for it outside of durability. It was sluggish, hard to control. It wasn't terribly maneuverable. What it was easy to be produced and required wood, not metal, not steel, not aluminum. And so, yeah, it was produced in quite large numbers, but performance was pretty meh. So much so that in 1941, it was ordered that it be dropped in favor of more Yak-1s, which we'll talk about the Yak in the third episode. Well, Lavochkin would not let this go, not after all these years of work. So, at the end of 41, at the winter of 42, really unofficially, he started work in a hut, taking the nose from a Sukhoi 2 and Su-2 and putting a radial engine into the LaGG-3. And that is where the La-5 was born, in a little hut on the outskirts of an airstrip during the deepest, darkest part of the Great Patriotic War. And this would really turn the whole series around. So it was kind of uncertain what putting a different engine would do. It was hoped to improve maneuverability, it was hoped to improve speed, but no one really knew. But in March of 42, the prototype took to the air, and results were better than expected. It was able to have higher speed and altitude, but really it performed better at low and medium heights, and really saved the whole design. In fact, by that summer, it was ordered that any LaGG-3s not complete should be finished out as what was becoming known as the La-5. So we have kind of a hybrid series here. And it should be noted that Gudkov would leave the team. This is why the GG was dropped. Except it is kind of odd. Gorbanov would stay on, yet his G was dropped too. I don't know. It became the La-5. And this was available in the front lines towards the second half of 1942. And was doing a lot better, but still had more to give. They would have the La-5F with an improved engine, and then you would have the La-5FN by 1943 here, which was a lightened airframe that used more metal. Still had a lot of wood in it, but it would use more metal, and that would really improve performance. It was a lighter plane with a more powerful radial engine. It was able to approach 400 miles per hour at altitude and exceed 360 miles per hour at lower altitude. It was about 28 foot long, had about a 32 foot wingspan. Now its max altitude was still lower than the MiG, about 36,000 feet. Not bad. Armament was pretty simple. Two 20mm cannon, at least as standard. And the Russians, they didn't like putting guns on the wings if they could help it. They preferred just kind of keeping them in the cowling here. And sometimes they would mount things under the wings, although this was mostly used as a fighter, going up against the latest Bf-109Gs and some of the Focke-Wulf FW-190s, and it did pretty good. Again, it was a durable airframe. Still wasn't the most high-performing aircraft around, but it was a lot better than the LaGG-3. And they would produce a good number of these through 1944-45, nearly 10,000 all told. On the other hand, they did suffer pretty high loss rates, but that's because, well, that's what Russia had, in addition to Lend-Lease aircraft. But the La-5 was just really kind of the in-between, and Lavochkin knew there was still a lot of room for improvement, and that's what gets us to the La-7, quite possibly one of the best fighters of World War II. The La-7, truth be told, if this were a Western fighter, it would probably be in the same series, kind of like Spitfire 1, 2, 5, and so on. But the way the Soviet convention went, this was considered a different aircraft to the La-5. And just as Lavochkin had perfected, at least approached perfecting his design from the 5 to the 5F to the 5FN, in 1943 he wasn't content and thought he could do better. This resulted in an experimental model known as the LA-120, which flew in the autumn of 1943, and thus became a modified La-5, which flew in February of 1944. And essentially it discontinued the trend that was started. We had a more powerful engine again. We had a redesigned cowling for it here, housing. We used more metal, including in the wings, kind of getting away from the wood. The airframe is increasingly lighter, better controls, better visibility for the pilot, more reliable systems. And this was put into production in the spring of 1944, and towards the end of that year, the La-5 was out of full production, being replaced by the La-7. Now, it was mostly an improvement. This was a more maneuverable aircraft, but it did give up some things. It had a slightly lower ceiling of about 34,000 feet versus 36,000, and it had shorter range. The La-5 was already kind of a limited range fighter of under 500 miles, but since it was designed to be a low to medium altitude fighter interceptor, when this had a range of about 400 miles, wasn't the end of the world. On the other hand, it was faster at well over 400 miles per hour at altitude, about 415 to 420. It still could carry a couple of bombs under the wings, and like the La-5, it originally was equipped with two 20mm cannon, each with 200 rounds in the nose here. Again, that's just kind of how the Russians like to do it, keeping aiming easy and keeping the wings light. They also improved the landing gear, strengthening them, going to better radios, that kind of thing. But towards the end of 44, they decided that the two cannon just weren't enough to go up against newer German bombers. So, at least with some production La-7s, they would introduce a third cannon. That was good for having 3 versus 2. However, the actual ammo capacity would go down to only 100 rounds per cannon. So 300 rounds total instead of 400, but you're able to put more weight on target quicker. So kind of gets into that short range, short duration fighter. But in other ways, the engine was more responsive, the controls were better, the layouts were improved in the cockpit. And even though some early planes had some issues with, well, to be fair, frankly, QC kind of plagued Russian planes in general up until 1944 for kind of obvious reasons. But, yeah, in 1945, this was the premier Russian fighter, certainly amongst their best. And while the La-5 would definitely continue to see service, I mean, they built the better part of 10,000, between 1944 and 1946, they were able to turn out about 5,800 La-7s, with about 500 of those being trainers. And this would actually be one of the first Soviet aircraft to get a NATO reporting name. This one would be Finn, because it would see service in the Russian Air Force through the Korean War period, not really being retired out until 1952. The La-7 would also see about 5 years of service in the Czech Air Force. So it was one that was exported, at least in some numbers, to a client or two. And was a very good aircraft by its own right. And not a whole lot more to say about it. Still kind of wondering why that second G got dropped, but oh well. As to these models, it's kind of interesting. This one, the La-7, is your typical IXO tooling base, although it's been marketed by Altea, Atlas, now most recently D'Agostini. Gear up or down, spinning propellers, perfectly good little economy model. But what's interesting, this La-5 is actually from SkyMax, which is essentially Hobbymaster, which means it's actually a high quality model. But it's always funny, the ones that they chose to do in the SkyMax range. It's really a shame they did not do more. They do some quite odd aircraft, but Has pretty much typical Hobby Master quality. Of course, gear up or down. It also has opening canopy. It doesn't come with a pilot figure, but I always stuff one in there for fun. Of course, spinning propellers. And it comes with the kind of a typical Hobby Master stand, just with a different base. So this is definitely the highest quality one here on the table. It's kind of interesting that they picked that and not the LaGG-3 or the La-7 or even the MiG-3. I don't know, must have been someone's favorite over there. Even though this is kind of often overlooked, it had an early reputation for being the guaranteed varnished coffin. Kind of its humble roots, it did mature with the 5 and the 7 into a very capable aircraft, and actually would lead to the last piston aircraft that the Soviet Air Forces would use, the La-9 and the La-11. After that, we would go to jet power, but that's a story for another video. And with that, we'll end episode 2 here, and in the final one, we'll talk about the yak. Who doesn't like to talk about yaks? Until then, this is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.